by 14 May 18, 1565. Just after sunrise, the sea around Malta began to disappear beneath sails. From the watchtowers overlooking the Grand Harbour, lookouts stared toward the horizon and saw what many had feared for months. Ship after ship emerged from the morning haze: galleys, transports, warships. An invasion fleet unlike anything the island had ever faced. The news spread quickly through the fortified towns of Burgu and Senglea. Church bells rang. Messengers hurried through narrow streets. Soldiers climbed the walls. Civilians carried supplies into storerooms. Across the harbour, artillery crews checked their guns one more time. Nobody on Malta could be entirely sure how many men were coming. Contemporary sources would later argue over the exact number. Some estimates were lower, others were much higher. But everyone could see the same thing with their own eyes. An empire had arrived. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had expanded across the Mediterranean. Its armies had conquered kingdoms, seized islands, and defeated some of the most powerful states in Europe and the Middle East. Now that empire had turned its attention toward a small rocky island south of Sicily. At first glance, Malta hardly seemed worth the effort. It possessed no great river, no vast farmland, no enormous population. Yet both sides understood that Malta was far more important than its size suggested. Whoever controlled the island could influence the sea routes connecting North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the Western Mediterranean. And for one military order, Malta was something even more important. It was their last home. Inside the island's fortifications stood the Knights Hospitaller. Driven from Rhodes decades earlier, they had rebuilt their power here. Now they faced the greatest challenge in their history. At the centre of the defence stood Grand Master Jean de Valette. He was nearly 70 years old. He had spent much of his life fighting the Ottomans. He knew exactly what kind of enemy was approaching. More importantly, he understood what would happen if Malta fell. The loss of the island would not simply destroy a fortress. It could destroy the knights themselves. As Ottoman ships continued arriving throughout the morning, the scale of the challenge became impossible to ignore. The defenders could not match the invaders man for man. They could not hope to defeat the Ottoman Empire in open battle. Their only chance was to survive, to hold, to make every wall, every tower, every gun position, and every street cost the attackers more time than they expected, because hidden beneath the coming siege was a simple truth. Outnumbered, isolated, and surrounded, the defenders of Malta survived not because they were stronger, but because they forced an empire into a battle it could not afford to lose. The Ottoman fleet had arrived. The siege was about to begin, and the fate of Malta would soon depend on whether a few hundred knights and their allies could endure one of the greatest sieges of the 16th century. The Great Siege of Malta did not truly begin in 1565. In many ways, it began more than 40 years earlier. In 1522, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent captured Rhodes after a long and brutal siege. For generations, the Knights Hospitaller had used Rhodes as their base in the eastern Mediterranean. From there, they challenged Muslim shipping, protected Christian trade routes, and served as one of the most visible military orders in Europe. When Rhodes fell, many believed the Knights would disappear. Instead, they survived. After years of uncertainty, Emperor Charles V granted them Malta in 1530. At first, Malta seemed an unlikely replacement. The island was small, its resources were limited, its terrain was rocky, fresh water was scarce. Yet its location made it invaluable. Malta sat near the centre of the Mediterranean, between Sicily and North Africa, directly along some of the most important sea routes in the region. The knights immediately recognized its potential. They strengthened fortifications, expanded harbour defences, built artillery positions. Most importantly, they continued doing what they had always done. They fought the Ottomans. Over the next 3 decades, the Mediterranean became one of the main frontiers in a struggle between two expanding worlds. On one side stood the Ottoman Empire. Under Suleiman, Ottoman armies marched across southeastern Europe. Ottoman fleets dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean. Ottoman influence stretched from Hungary to North Africa. To many observers, Ottoman power seemed unstoppable. On the other side stood a collection of Christian kingdoms and states that rarely agreed with one another. Spain pursued its own interests. Venice pursued its own interests. The papacy pursued its own interests. Cooperation was difficult. Yet one group remained consistently aggressive: the Knights Hospitaller. Operating from Malta, they launched raids against Ottoman shipping, intercepted merchant vessels, captured prisoners, and disrupted trade routes. These operations brought wealth. They also brought enemies. Every successful raid strengthened the Knights. Every captured ship increased Ottoman anger. One Hospitaller captain became particularly famous: Mathurin Romigas. An aggressive and highly successful corsair, Romigas repeatedly attacked Ottoman shipping. His victories enhanced the reputation of the order, but also helped convince Ottoman leaders that Malta could no longer be ignored. From Constantinople, the situation increasingly appeared intolerable. The empire controlled vast territories surrounding the Mediterranean. Yet a small island occupied by a few hundred knights continued interfering with important sea routes. Malta was no longer merely an annoyance. It had become a strategic problem. By the early 1560s, both sides could see where events were heading. In 1560, a Christian coalition suffered a major defeat at Jerba. The result strengthened Ottoman naval prestige and alarmed Christian Europe. The question was not whether the Ottomans would launch another major operation. The question was where. Malta was an obvious target. The island occupied a critical position. Its defenders were hostile. Its destruction would remove a persistent threat and send a powerful message throughout the Mediterranean. Whether the Ottomans intended Malta as a stepping stone towards Sicily remains debated by historians. Some sources suggest broader ambitions. Others argue the objective was simply to eliminate the Knights. Whatever the ultimate goal, one fact is clear: Malta mattered enough for Suleiman to commit a major expedition. To carry out the campaign, he appointed experienced commanders. Mustafa Pasha would command the land forces. Piale Pasha would command the fleet. Later, the famous corsair Dragut would join the operation. On paper, that balance of power seemed obvious. The Ottomans possessed larger armies, more ships, greater resources, far more manpower. The defenders possessed none of those advantages. Yet sieges are rarely won on paper. Inside Malta, Jean de Valette spent months preparing for the invasion he believed was coming. He strengthened defences, stockpiled supplies, organised local militia, inspected fortifications, studied every harbour and every approach the enemy might use. He understood something many commanders learn too late. When a stronger enemy is coming, preparation becomes a weapon. By the spring of 1565, both sides had committed themselves to a course from which there was no easy return. The Ottomans were preparing one of the largest amphibious operations of the century. The Knights were preparing for a siege that might destroy them. Neither side knew exactly how the campaign would unfold, but both understood that once the first Ottoman soldiers stepped ashore, events would begin moving beyond anyone's control. When the Ottoman fleet arrived off Malta in May of 1565, the campaign immediately became a contest of geography. The island itself was not large. What mattered were its harbours. More specifically, what mattered were a handful of fortifications controlling those harbours. The Grand Harbour cut deeply into the coastline, creating one of the finest natural anchorages in the Mediterranean. Nearby lay Marsamxett Harbour. Between them rose a rocky peninsula known as Mount Sybaris. Today, the area is dominated by Valletta. In 1565, Valletta did not yet exist. Instead, a chain of fortifications protected the approaches. At the tip of Mount Sybaris stood Fort St. Elmo. Across the water stood Fort St. Angelo, the strongest defensive position on the island. Nearby stood the fortified towns of Birgu and Senglea. Together, they formed the core of Malta's defences. For any attacker, the geography presented a difficult problem. Every harbour entrance mattered. Every artillery position mattered. Every elevated piece of terrain mattered. The Ottomans quickly identified what they believed was the key: Fort St. Elmo. As long as the fortress remained in Hospitaller hands, Ottoman naval operations would be restricted. The fort appeared vulnerable. It was smaller than St. Angelo, more exposed, more isolated. Many Ottoman commanders believed it would fall quickly. That assumption would shape the entire campaign. Meanwhile, preparations continued on both sides. Inside the Ottoman camps, engineers surveyed the ground. Labourers unloaded supplies. Heavy artillery was dragged into position. Siege trenches began creeping forward across the rocky landscape. Thousands of soldiers established camps. Janissaries sharpened weapons. Officers reviewed plans. Sailors maintained ships. The Ottoman army represented one of the most sophisticated military forces in the world. Its elite Janissaries were disciplined, experienced, and accustomed to major campaigns. Supporting them were additional infantry formations, cavalry, engineers, artillery specialists, sailors, and labourers. Their advantage was not simply numbers, it was organisation. Artillery could weaken defences. Engineers could create opportunities. Infantry could exploit breaches. The fleet could support operations from the sea. In theory, it was an ideal siege machine. Yet every large army creates its own vulnerabilities. The larger the force, the more supplies it consumes. The longer the campaign lasts, the more difficult logistics become. Every casualty matters. Every delay matters. Every failed assault matters. Inside Malta, Jean de Valette focused on efficiency. Every gun emplacement had a purpose. Every soldier had a position. Every available supply was conserved. The defenders included Knights Hospitaller, Spanish troops, Italian soldiers, Maltese militia, sailors, and volunteers. Their equipment varied. Some carried arquebuses, others carried pikes. Many relied on swords and polearms. What united them was necessity. There was nowhere else to go. Retreat was not an option. As Ottoman preparations accelerated, daily life inside Malta changed. Food was rationed. Buildings were converted for military use. Walls were reinforced. Artillery ammunition was distributed. Civilians assisted with repairs and logistics. Every day brought new reports from scouts. Every day confirmed the same reality. The siege was coming. The defenders also faced another uncertainty. Would help arrive from Sicily? The Viceroy of Sicily understood Malta's importance, but he also understood the risks. Sending relief too early could expose Sicily itself. As a result, the defenders could not assume rescue was imminent. They had to prepare as though they would stand alone. Ottoman soldiers expected victory. The defenders hoped for survival. One side planned how to win, the other planned how to endure. By late May, Ottoman artillery positions were ready. The fleet had completed its landing operations. The commanders had chosen their first objective. The preparations were complete, and all attention turned toward Fort St. Elmo, a small fortress that many believed would fall within days. Instead, it was about to consume far more time, men, and blood than anyone expected. The first shots of the siege were fired before most of Europe fully understood what was happening. For the defenders inside Malta, however, the reality was impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire had arrived in force. Now the question was whether Fort St. Elmo could survive long enough to matter. At first, many Ottoman commanders believed the answer was obvious. No. The fortress sat on exposed ground at the tip of Mount Siberas. Compared to the larger defensive positions around Burgu and Senglea, it appeared vulnerable. Heavy artillery could be brought against it from multiple directions. Naval forces could support operations nearby. The garrison was relatively small. Everything suggested a quick victory. The plan seemed straightforward. Capture St. Elmo. Secure the harbour approaches. Move the fleet into better positions. Then concentrate overwhelming force against the main defences. On paper, the sequence made perfect sense. The problem was that wars are not fought on paper. They are fought on terrain. They are fought by people. And they are fought under conditions that rarely cooperate with plans. As Ottoman artillery batteries opened fire, the bombardment was relentless. Day after day, cannonballs smashed into walls, towers, and defensive positions. Stone shattered. Dust filled the air. Sections of the fortress began to collapse. From a distance, observers could see the damage accumulating. Yet each morning revealed something deeply frustrating. The defenders were still there. Every night, under cover of darkness, repairs continued. Damaged walls were reinforced. Defensive positions were rebuilt. Rubble was cleared. The garrison understood its mission. They were not expected to defeat the Ottoman army. They were expected to delay it. That distinction changed everything. For the Ottomans, every additional day represented another expenditure of time, ammunition, and manpower. For the defenders, every additional day represented success. The same battlefield produced two completely different measurements of victory. As the siege intensified, boats crossed the harbour at night, carrying supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the fortress. The crossings were dangerous. Ottoman guns constantly searched for targets, yet enough men and material continued reaching St. Elmo to keep the defence alive. Jean de Valette faced an increasingly difficult decision. Some officers believed the fortress should eventually be abandoned. The losses were mounting, the walls were crumbling, the position appeared doomed. Resources might be better saved for Burgu and Senglea. The argument was logical. Every experienced commander understands there are moments when preserving forces becomes more important than holding ground. But de Valette saw something else. If St. Elmo fell quickly, the Ottomans would gain exactly what they wanted: time, momentum, access. The defenders would lose all three. So the order remained unchanged: hold the fort. The decision came at a terrible cost. Every reinforcement sent into St. Elmo entered a position that might never be evacuated. Many of those men understood exactly what was expected of them, yet they went anyway. As the days passed, Ottoman frustration increased. Repeated bombardments created breaches. Assault teams advanced. Janissaries stormed damaged sections of the defences. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted among shattered walls. Again and again, the attackers expected the end to come. Again and again, the defenders refused to collapse. What appeared from a distance to be a small fortress was becoming a battlefield that absorbed men at an alarming rate. Every assault produced casualties. Every assault required new preparations. Every assault delayed the next phase of the campaign. The decision to attack St. Elmo first had created an unexpected problem. The Ottomans could not easily stop. Too much time had already been invested. Too many losses had already been suffered. To abandon the operation would waste everything that had come before. To continue meant spending even more resources. The siege was becoming a trap of commitment. Meanwhile, conditions continued to worsen. The Maltese summer was unforgiving. Heat settled over the island. Water remained precious. Dust filled trenches and artillery positions. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smell of death. For soldiers on both sides, the physical burden of the campaign increased with every passing week. By early June, it was becoming increasingly clear that St. Elmo was not behaving like a fortress on the verge of immediate collapse. Instead, it was consuming the attention of the entire Ottoman operation. This attracted the involvement of one of the most respected commanders in the Mediterranean, Dragut. Known throughout Europe as a brilliant corsair and experienced military leader, Dragut possessed decades of experience fighting across the region. His arrival strengthened Ottoman leadership and brought valuable expertise to the siege. His presence also reflected a growing reality. The campaign was proving more difficult than expected. Additional talent was needed. Additional solutions were needed. Additional pressure would have to be applied. The Ottomans intensified their efforts. Artillery fire increased. Assaults became more aggressive. Engineers pushed siege works closer to the defences. The objective remained unchanged. Break St. Elmo. Open the harbours. Move the campaign forward. But every decision generated new consequences. More artillery fire weakened the fort, but consumed ammunition. More assaults increased pressure, but increased casualties. More time invested created greater pressure to achieve results. The siege had entered a dangerous cycle. Then came the event that nobody had planned for. Dragut was mortally wounded. The exact details remain disputed. Different contemporary accounts tell the story differently. What is not disputed is the outcome. One of the Ottoman Empire's most capable commanders was gone. His death did not stop the siege. The artillery continued firing. The assaults continued. The trenches continued advancing. But the campaign had lost one of its strongest leaders. Meanwhile, St. Elmo continued paying for every additional day with blood. By the second half of June, much of the fortress had been reduced to ruins. Walls had collapsed. Gun positions had been shattered. The defenders were exhausted. Yet they remained. The decision made weeks earlier by Jean de Valette was finally producing its intended effect. The fort was dying. But it was dying slowly. And every day it remained alive was another day the Ottomans could not devote their full attention to the main defences. Eventually, however, even the most determined resistance has limits. On June 23, Fort St. Elmo finally fell. The surviving defenders fought to the end. Many were killed during the final attacks. Others died among the ruins they had spent weeks defending. For the Ottomans, the victory was real. The fortress had been captured. The harbour approaches were now more accessible. A major obstacle had been removed. But victory did not feel decisive. The cost had been far higher than expected. Instead of securing a quick success, the Ottomans had spent nearly a month fighting for a position they originally believed would fall within days. The campaign could continue. but it could not recover the lost time, and time was becoming increasingly important. Now attention shifted towards the true heart of Malta's defences. Birgu, Senglea, Fort St. Angelo. The position Jean de Valette had been trying to protect all along. The bombardment began almost immediately. Heavy guns targeted walls, towers, buildings, and defensive works. Day after day, artillery pat the fortified towns. The landscape itself began to change. Buildings collapsed. Churches suffered damage. Streets filled with rubble. Entire sections of the defensive perimeter became difficult to recognize, yet the defenders continued adapting. Breaches were reinforced. Barricades appeared behind damaged walls. Reserve positions were prepared. Whenever one line became vulnerable, another line was established behind it. The defense became increasingly layered. This created a new challenge for the Ottomans. Breaking through a wall no longer guaranteed success. Every breach simply revealed another obstacle. As July turned into August, major assaults became more frequent. Janissaries advanced against damaged sections of the fortifications. Engineers attempted to widen breaches. Artillery sought to create opportunities. Again and again, commanders searched for the breakthrough that would finally end the siege. One of the most dangerous moments came during a massive assault against Senglea and Birgu. For a brief period, success appeared possible. Ottoman troops reached key defensive positions. Some penetrated sections of the outer works. The situation became chaotic. Inside the defensive lines, reports arrived from multiple directions. Walls were under pressure. Casualties were mounting. Enemy troops were appearing where they were not supposed to be. For Jean de Valette, this represented the type of moment every commander fears. Not a gradual defeat, a sudden collapse, the kind that spreads faster than orders can travel. De Valette responded personally. Although elderly, he remained highly active throughout the siege. Contemporary accounts describe him moving where he was needed most, encouraging defenders and coordinating responses. Whether every detail reported by later chroniclers is accurate remains uncertain. What is clear is that his presence mattered. At critical moments, leadership itself became a weapon. Reserves were committed. Counterattacks were launched. Threatened sectors were reinforced. The defenders managed to stabilize the situation. The breakthrough never fully materialized. The Ottoman attack inflicted severe damage, but it failed to end the siege. The result created another problem. Every failed assault increased losses. Every failed assault reduced the number of experienced soldiers available for future operations. Every failed assault consumed precious time, and time continued working against the attackers. By August, exhaustion affected both sides. The defenders lived among ruins. Food remained a concern. Sleep was limited. Casualties continued accumulating, yet the Ottoman army faced its own growing pressures. Supplies had to be maintained. Troops had to remain effective. Disease became a concern. The heat remained relentless. Most importantly, uncertainty surrounding relief forces grew larger with every passing week. From the beginning, the defenders had hoped Sicily would eventually send help. Now, those hopes became increasingly important. A successful relief force could transform the strategic situation. Without outside assistance, survival remained uncertain. The siege had become a race. Could the Ottomans break the defences before help arrived? Or could Malta hold long enough for the balance of power to change? As summer moved towards September, the answer finally appeared on the horizon. Ships, troops, reinforcements from Sicily. The relief force was not enormous by the standards of the age. It did not need to be. Its significance was strategic rather than numerical. The defenders were no longer alone. For the Ottoman commanders, the situation had changed dramatically. Months of fighting had produced heavy losses. Key objectives remained incomplete. The defenders were still resisting. Now, fresh enemy troops were entering the campaign. The decision facing Ottoman leadership was difficult. Continue the operation and risk even greater losses, or withdraw and preserve what remained of the army. Neither option was attractive, but one was increasingly necessary. Eventually, the decision was made. The siege would end. The Ottoman forces began preparing to leave Malta. What had begun as a campaign expected to deliver a decisive victory had become something very different, a costly withdrawal. As Ottoman troops embarked and ships departed the island, the defenders watched carefully. After months of bombardment, assaults, fear, and uncertainty, the reality was finally becoming clear. Malta had survived. Not because the defenders had destroyed the Ottoman Empire, not because they had won every battle, but because they had endured long enough to make victory too expensive. The siege was over. The cost, however, was only beginning to become visible. When the last Ottoman ships disappeared beyond the horizon in September of 1565, Malta did not look like the site of a glorious victory. It looked like a battlefield that had been pushed beyond its limits. Months of bombardment had transformed large sections of the island's defensive centres into ruins. Walls were shattered, buildings had collapsed, entire neighbourhoods bore the scars of artillery fire. The ground around the fortifications was littered with broken weapons, damaged equipment, and the remains of those who had died during the fighting. For the defenders, survival came with a terrible price. The celebrations that followed the siege were real, but so was the exhaustion. Many of the men who had stood on the walls in May were no longer there in September. Some had died at Fort St. Elmo. Others had fallen during the repeated assaults on Burgu and Senglea. Still others carried wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The exact casualty figures remain a subject of debate among historians. Contemporary writers often exaggerated numbers for political, religious, or personal reasons. Some accounts reported extremely high Ottoman losses. Others offered more conservative estimates. Modern historians generally agree that both sides suffered heavily, but the precise sites totals are impossible to establish with certainty. What mattered to those living through the siege was not the exact number. It was the scale of the sacrifice. Every family on Malta knew someone who had been lost. Every street carried reminders of the fighting. Every damaged wall represented weeks of fear, labour and endurance. The cost of survival could be measured everywhere. At the centre of the victory stood Jean de Valette. The Grand Master had survived. Throughout the siege, he had become more than a commander. He had become the symbol holding the defence together. His determination helped maintain morale during the darkest moments, especially when Fort St. Elmo fell and when Ottoman assaults threatened to break through the defences around Burgu and Senglea. After the Ottoman withdrawal, his reputation spread rapidly across Europe. Princes praised him. Church leaders celebrated him. Writers compared him to heroes of earlier centuries. Money and support flowed toward Malta from across the continent. Yet de Valette himself understood something many distant observers did not. The defenders had not achieved an effortless triumph. They had barely survived. The difference mattered. On the Ottoman side, the campaign was interpreted differently. The siege had failed to achieve its objective, but the empire remained powerful. Ottoman Ottoman armies still controlled enormous territories. Ottoman fleets still operated throughout much of the Mediterranean. One unsuccessful campaign did not erase decades of military success. From Constantinople, the setback was serious but not catastrophic. For European observers, however, the psychological impact was enormous. For years, many had viewed Ottoman expansion as almost unstoppable. The defense of Malta challenged that perception. It demonstrated that determined resistance, strong fortifications, effective leadership, and favorable terrain could frustrate even one of the most powerful military systems in the world. That lesson spread quickly. But before Malta could become a symbol, it first had to recover. Its defences required rebuilding. Its population needed relief. Its leaders had to prepare for the possibility that the Ottomans might one day return. Because despite the celebrations, one uncomfortable reality remained. The struggle for control of the Mediterranean was far from over. The Great Siege had ended. Its consequences were only beginning. The significance of the Great Siege of Malta has been debated almost from the moment it ended. Contemporary Europeans often described it as a turning point in the struggle between Christian Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Poets, diplomats, chroniclers, and religious leaders celebrated the defense as one of the greatest victories of the age. The reality was more complicated. The Ottoman Empire remained one of the most powerful states in the world after 1565. Its armies were still formidable. Its economy remained strong. Its fleets continued operating across the Mediterranean. The empire did not suddenly enter decline because of one failed siege. Yet that does not mean Malta was unimportant. Far from it. Military history is often shaped not only by territory and casualties, but by confidence. And confidence changed after Malta. Before the siege, many Europeans had become accustomed to hearing stories of Ottoman victories. Rhodes had fallen. Belgrade had fallen. Jerba had fallen. Ottoman armies and fleets had repeatedly demonstrated their effectiveness across multiple theatres of war. The defence of Malta provided a different story. It showed that Ottoman campaigns could fail. It showed that preparation, fortifications, leadership, and endurance could offset overwhelming numerical disadvantages. Most importantly, it gave Christian Europe a badly needed psychological victory. That psychological effect extended far beyond Malta itself. The island quickly became a symbol. Money and support flowed toward the Knights Hospitaller. Engineers, architects, and military planners began considering how Malta could be transformed into an even stronger fortress. One decision in particular would shape the island's future for centuries: the construction of a new fortified city. On the high ground of Mount Siberas, where so much fighting had taken place during the siege, work began on an ambitious project. The city would be named Valletta in honour of Jean de Valette. Its design reflected lessons learned during the siege: stronger walls, improved artillery positions, better defensive planning, greater ability to resist future attacks. What had once been a vulnerable position became one of the strongest fortified cities in Europe. The knights themselves also survived. That fact should not be overlooked. At the beginning of the campaign, there were genuine fears that the order might cease to exist as an effective military force. The loss of Malta could have ended centuries of Hospitaller influence in the Mediterranean. Instead, the order emerged with greater prestige than ever. The siege transformed the knights from regional defenders into international symbols of resistance. The consequences also extended into broader Mediterranean politics. Only 6 years later, in 1571, a coalition of Christian powers achieved a major naval victory over the Ottoman fleet at Lepanto. Malta did not directly cause Lepanto. History is rarely that simple. But the successful defence of Malta helped create an atmosphere in which cooperation against Ottoman power seemed more realistic. It encouraged rulers to believe that resistance could succeed. That belief mattered. Historians continue to debate exactly how decisive the siege truly was. Some argue that Malta's importance has been exaggerated by later writers eager to create a dramatic narrative. Others contend that the psychological and strategic effects were profound, even if they are difficult to measure. Both perspectives contain elements of truth. The siege did not destroy Ottoman power, but neither was it merely a symbolic event with no lasting consequences. Its importance lies somewhere between those extremes. What remains remarkable is the simple fact that the campaign unfolded at all. One of the most powerful empires on earth committed enormous resources to capturing a small island. A few hundred knights, supported by soldiers, sailors, and local inhabitants, refused to surrender. Neither side achieved exactly what it expected. The Ottomans won battles but lost the campaign. The defenders survived, but at immense cost. And that is perhaps why the story continues to resonate centuries later. Not because it was a tale of effortless heroism. Not because a small force somehow destroyed a giant empire. But because it demonstrated a lesson that appears again and again throughout military history. Strength alone does not determine outcomes. Leadership matters, preparation matters, terrain matters, timing matters. And sometimes the most important victory is simply enduring longer than the enemy expected. Centuries later, visitors walking through Valletta can still see the harbours that shaped the siege. They can stand on ground where artillery once thundered, where walls once crumbled, and where commanders on both sides made decisions that affected the course of history. The ships are gone. The soldiers are gone. The empire that launched the invasion is gone. Yet the stone fortifications remain. And they still tell the story of the summer, when a small island stood against one of the greatest powers of its age and refused to yield.